The FBI had a certain set of lenses through which they looked and perceived the world. And CIA had its own lenses that made it look at and perceive things in a certain way. It's only when you have sort of those 3D glasses that put them together that you get the full perspective and things really come to life.
Hi, I'm Mike Hurley.
I'm Barbara Grewe.
We're the hosts of the Are We Safer Today podcast. In this podcast, we speak with members of the 9/11 Commission staff about their unique experiences in the investigation into the 9/11 attacks.
The 9/11 Commission was chartered by Congress to investigate the most significant attack on American soil since Pearl Harbor. Supporting the work of the commissioners, the commission's staff was tasked with reconstructing a complex jigsaw puzzle. What led to 9/11? What happened on that day? What should we do about it? But unlike a typical jigsaw puzzle, the pieces were not in a box. There was no image of what the solved puzzle would look like, and many of the pieces were missing. I'm Barbara Grewe.
I'm Mike Hurley, and this is the Are We Safer Today podcast. Before we jump into our interviews with our former colleagues, we start with our own personal perspectives about working on the 9/11 Commission staff. In her role as a senior counsel of the Commission, Barbara Grewe's piece of the puzzle included investigating what the government knew in the months shortly before the attacks and how it responded, a period of time commonly referred to as the Summer of Threat. Barbara examined how the greatest nation on earth failed to protect its citizens. When the light was blinking red and alarm bells were ringing, why weren't our government institutions better able to protect us? We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Philanthropic Foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. We would like to thank the Wilson Center for sponsoring the Are We Safer Today podcast. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. Barbara, what was your role in the 9/11 Commission investigation?
So my official title was senior counsel for the commission. But I was more sort of a utility infielder.
What's a senior counsel?
I mean, it meant that I was a lawyer, but it meant that I was one of the senior leaders on the staff who came with a significant background in the work, like what the commission was doing, and experience in conducting investigations. So being a leader and advisor at sort of the high levels of the commission was sort of the intended role. But I worked across all the different teams, started out leading Team 6 that was looking at the FBI, but then moved to the front office where I covered those cross-cutting issues that didn't fit neatly into the team structure that had been created for the commission.
So I know a fair amount about your very, very impressive background. Could you do a bit of a deeper dive? Because I think our listeners would really be interested in learning a bit more about Barbara Grewe.
So I was a lawyer by training and did private practice, but then had the chance to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington, D.C., where I was a federal prosecutor, and did all kinds of investigations there, starting out in misdemeanors, where my very first case in court was a sentencing, where I accidentally asked for twice the amount of time that was the statutory maximum and got the nickname Maximum Babs, to doing public corruption cases. And so I did lots of investigations. After the U.S. Attorney's Office, I went over to GAO, where I was an Associate General Counsel, where I was detailed to the 9/11 Commission.
What is GAO?
The Government Accountability Office, which is the investigative arm of Congress.
So it's not one that just counts beans, accountability in that sense.
No, it really conducts a lot of investigations to look for fraud or poor management, or to be able to make recommendations on how government could be better. And so that experience also added to what I could bring to the commission, because the commission was very interested in making recommendations. And then I was racing sailboats, and the person whose boat I was on worked for the MITRE Corporation and said, we need someone with your background based on the 9/11 Commission, and that's how I came to the MITRE Corporation.
Navigating choppy ocean waters might be a good metaphor for what you did as a federal prosecutor. How long were you a federal prosecutor?
13 years.
So I think it's fair to say that you had pretty deep experience in complex investigations. That experience had to be valuable for your work on the commission.
Yes. I think part of being a good investigator is understanding not only the questions that need to be asked, but who might be the best people to answer them, and what kind of documentation there might be to support those answers.
You also had worked as a special investigative counsel for the Department of Justice Inspector General's office. Did that have particular relevance for your role on the commission?
Of course it did. For a couple reasons. One is those investigations were much more like the 9/11 Commission investigations than a normal prosecution. We weren't looking to necessarily indict somebody, but to find the facts. And then that led to my coming on the detail, which was looking at how the FBI handled intelligence prior to 9/11. And I focused on specifically the story of Hazmi and Midhar, who were two of the hijackers that were on the plane that went into the Pentagon. They were originally scheduled to be pilots. They failed at a pilot school in San Diego, but then became muscle men. But they're two people.
What are muscle men?
They're two of the people who helped actually hijack the plane and get control of it for the pilot to actually fly it into the building. An important aspect of the Hazmi Midhar story was the U.S. government knew about them well in advance of the 9/11 attacks. We had learned about them in late 1999. We followed them to Kuala Lumpur. Some parts of the government knew that they had active visas to get into the United States. So if we had an opportunity to stop the plot, a key one would have been stopping Hazmi and Midhar from coming to the United States or finding out what they had been involved in planning. And so getting to know that was an important basis for the work that I then did when I came to the 9/11 Commission.
Just to pick up on that for a moment, that would, it seems to me, be an instance of where there may have been a breakdown in sharing of information among different agencies with national security responsibilities for the U.S. government.
The Hazmi Midhar story is a very disappointing and frustrating example of what happened prior to 9/11. If we look in the report, we list a number of the failed opportunities to share information, and many of those related to the Hazmi Midhar story, and failures of information about what the CIA knew and what the FBI knew, and putting those pieces together. And so the number of times that we came very close to having real insights into what was happening, we lost it because we did not have the opportunity for that. That information wasn't shared. There were opportunities, but the information just wasn't shared for a number of reasons. And so the Hazmi Midhar story is particularly frustrating one. And for me personally, because they were two of the hijackers on the plane that went into the Pentagon. And a friend of mine from the U.S. Attorney's Office and part of my girls' poker club was on that plane. And so I was investigating the murder of my friend.
That was Barbara Olson, wasn't it?
That was Barbara Olson.
So if I'm tracking with what you're saying here, you're not saying that being on to Hazmi and Midhar would have prevented the 9/11 attacks, but it might have given us a chance, a better chance to prevent it. Maybe. We'll never know. Is that what you think?
I think that that's absolutely fair. I would put it as this. We will never know whether if the information had been shared in a timely fashion, whether we would have stopped the plot, but I sure would have liked to have had the chance to do it.
Many of the staff members on the 9/11 Commission were assigned to a particular team focused on a very specific part of the investigation. Barbara, you, however, had a unique cross-cutting role that looked at issues that could not be confined to the work of a single team. How did all that come about?
Well, when I was first hired to the commission, my job was to lead Team 6 that was looking at the FBI and how it had handled the case, the various threats, all the things that they had been doing in counterterrorism. And so for several months, I led that team and traveled to a number of the field offices and did all those interviews and gathered significant documents and pulled that together. But it became apparent that while this team structure that initially existed, and I think that there were a total of 9 teams, each having their own remit for what they were supposed to focus on, that there were many of these questions that couldn't be confined to a single team, like the Hazmi Midhar story and some of the other information that we had gotten about the threats prior to 9/11. And that required someone who could work with each of the teams for the relevant pieces of that. And so I was asked to take on that role and sort of in the front office to work across those teams so that we could make sure that we were totally coordinated and all the relevant information that might be in the possession of the particular teams could be brought together into a cohesive story.
There's a term, the summer of threat. What the heck is the summer of threat? What does that mean, and why is it important?
We've known for years the threat from al-Qaeda. I mean, we knew about bin Laden. There had been the bombings in 1998 of the embassies in Africa. There had been the bombing of the USS Cole.
That was a Navy warship.
In Yemen in 2000. There was, the attacks on the World Trade Center. There were failed attacks on landmarks in New York City. So we generally knew about a threat from al-Qaeda. So beginning in March of 2001, there was what was known as a significant increase of what was known as chatter, meaning that our intelligence agencies were picking up intelligence from potential terrorists out there that something was being planned.
Conversations, they were.
There could be conversations or documents or other communications, but there was clearly terrorists communicating with each other in some form that something big was planned. And so the level of threat went from the normal level of, yes, al-Qaeda is bad and wants to hurt us, to they are planning something really big and we need to stop it. There was a huge spike in the volume, and B, the content was very troubling. So it was clear that whatever they were planning was going to be, as someone said, big, big, very big. So the intelligence community then began trying to determine who's plotting it, what are they plotting, where's it going to be. And over the summer, the drumbeat of these threats and chatter got more significant and more worrisome. And so over the summer of 2001, that summer of threat, the level of concern increased dramatically, and therefore the amount of activity and things that were being done by the various parts of the U.S. government to address whatever this threat might be increased commensurately.
Another phrase that's really quite closely associated with your work is the title of Chapter 8 of the 9/11 Commission report. The system was blinking red. What was the system and why was it blinking red?
So George Tenet,
who was
the director of Central Intelligence Agency and actually oversaw the intelligence community at the time, coined the phrase that the system was blinking red. I think that's a reference actually to aviation, of systems blinking red, that there's it's a warning signal.
There's danger, some flashing red light.
Exactly. There's this danger, and you need to pay attention to it. Your console in front of you is, the lights are flashing red. It's, you better do something, and you better do it fast.
And the system might have referred to that signal was coming across all the various national security components.
That's correct. I mean, he used it as a metaphor, but it really was that over that summer of threat, there were enough of those flashing red lights, those warning systems that were saying, we are in danger, we need to do something. And so the chapter, The System Was Blinking Red, is sort of the drumbeat of the warnings we got and then what we did or did not do in response to that. We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The philanthropic foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. And the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community.
So, Barbara, you're the expert on that summer. Would it be fair to say that our national security experts believed that it was likely some sort of attack would be happening, but they didn't have specifics as to know exactly what? Maybe they thought it would be another attack overseas, perhaps against an embassy or a military installation, something that we'd seen in the past, but that most maybe didn't think that something might happen against the United States here in our homeland.
That's exactly correct. One of the challenges was that each part of the intelligence agency was looking at this threat through their own lenses. So you've got the CIA, for example, that focuses on foreign threats, and they were looking overseas, and the Department of Defense was looking overseas. So they responded by moving the Fifth Fleet. They closed the embassy in Sana'a. They took a number of actions overseas because their assumption was, well, we've had the attacks in the embassies in Africa, we've had the attacks on the USS Cole, it's likely another one of those.
So to use your sailing experience, they battening down the hatches overseas.
Yes, they definitely did that. So they took a lot of actions, but they didn't have a game plan. Any kind of effective game plan for the U.S. government must bring all of the U.S. government to bear on this. And so we had the FBI that was focused domestically. Anything that they were looking at would have been focused as a domestic threat of something. But here we had a foreign threat on our domestic soil, and nobody was imagining that that was a possibility, let alone something they needed to respond to. And that was reflected in the kinds of responses or lack of responses. So, for example, early on in July, the thought was, well, maybe because al-Qaeda likes very symbolic dates, that they might pick the 4th of July to conduct this attack on the United States. So Richard Clarke was the senior director and presidential advisor on counterterrorism at the White House as part of the national security staff. And he called together a meeting of a number of people from the domestic agencies to tell them about this drumbeat of threats. But significantly during that meeting, he told the people that they could not go back to their agencies and tell anyone else about what they had heard. They didn't develop a game plan. And so what happened out of that meeting was there were a number of additional people who knew that there was a potential plot, but they weren't tasked with doing anything. They couldn't tell anyone about it. And so the meeting did not actually result in additional action within the United States to try to thwart a plot. So people weren't warned. I think today, something like that, we would communicate it to the American public. We certainly didn't do that back then. We didn't harden the borders. We didn't take the kinds of actions one would expect if you thought that a threat was going to happen within the United States.
You're telling us about some really extraordinary events that were taking place in summer of 2001. And if I can sort of summarize it at this point, so alarm bells were going off. But at least in some senses, those alarm bells didn't lead people fully to the fire or the fire that was going to be happening. Can you talk about the challenges you faced in pulling these pieces together to understand the complexities of this, who knew what, and why these alarms did not lead to effective action? And the government wasn't able really to stop the 9/11 plot. And one thing that I think might work into this is I remember that the FBI field office, I think it was in Minneapolis, had a report of a Middle Easterner who had come to the U.S., into that area, I think, to take flying lessons, to learn how to fly big jet planes, commercial planes, but that he didn't seem to be interested in learning either how to handle a takeoff or a landing of the planes. And this was written up, but somehow it never got to the right people in national security. And I recall, I think, when Richard Clark, who you were talking about, was asked about that, well, what would you have done if you had known that information? And his answer was, we would have been at battle stations. So very interested in your thoughts about how all that sort of played out.
Well, what you're referring to is the investigation into Moussaoui, who was the pilot who had come to flight school in Minneapolis, and an astute flight instructor. When I was a prosecutor, we had what we called JDLRs, just doesn't look right. And that was this flight instructor. There was something that just did not look right with Moussaoui, and he reported it to the FBI field office in Minneapolis. And there was an agent there who took it very seriously and just did everything he could to try to get as much information as possible about Moussaoui, including from overseas partners, as well as anything he could get. And he wanted to get a warrant to search Moussaoui's laptop, and he contacted FBI headquarters to see whether he could get a national security type of warrant. They're called Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act warrant. Those warrants are intended against foreign enemies as opposed to U.S. citizens.
And a judge on the FISA court, a special court, had to sign off on that.
That's correct. And so it's a completely different process than the normal criminal warrant that you get. So the agents in Minneapolis contacted FBI headquarters and tried to convince them to authorize getting this type of FISA warrant. And the individuals at FBI headquarters were not convinced that this warranted that type of activity. In a moment of amazing foresight, one of the agents in Minneapolis said, "We're just trying to prevent him from flying a plane into the World Trade Center."
Oh, my God.
And the agents at headquarters said, "That's not going to happen." And the answer was...
I have to catch my breath on that because that's extraordinary.
Yes. And at FBI headquarters, not only did they not authorize going to get this FISA warrant, but they never raised it up the chain in the FBI leadership to have sort of someone more senior make decisions about this. It was kept at sort of a minimal supervisory level. Decisions were being made that had extreme consequences. In fact, Ramzi Youssef, who was one of members of al-Qaeda and who had been involved in the World Trade Center bombing in 1993, had said that if they had known that Moussaoui had been arrested, that they would have postponed the plot because they would have been afraid about what he might have told. And so it was very consequential that this decision was made at a fairly low level at the FBI. And even though the agents in Minneapolis were raising the alarm, having their own sort of system blinking red, the leadership at the supervisory levels at the FBI did not see the importance and did not take action to try to move that forward.
You'd like to think that if that information had gone up to the highest levels of national security decision-making, that their hair would have been on fire.
Yes. And it's interesting that you mention that because we have an example, and this was one of our teammates who's on your team, Mike, Alexis Albion, was looking through materials at the CIA, and she called me up and said, "I found this briefing for Director Tennant that says Islamists learning to fly. Do you think that that's important?" I said, "Well, yes, Alexis, that is important." The importance of that briefing to Director Tennant was that briefing was about Moussaoui. Didn't use his name, but it was about him. And that got all the way up to the highest level of the CIA, where the agents trying to work that could not get that up to the highest levels of the FBI. And so it shows the difference of importance between that kind of information in the different agencies at the time. And Director Tennant was asked, well, did he call the director of the FBI, who was an acting director that summer? It was shortly before Director Mueller came on board in September of 2001. And he was asked, well, did he contact the FBI about this? And he said, no, that wasn't his responsibility. This was a domestic issue. It had to do with something happening in the U.S., so it was the FBI's job. He assumed that they were looking at it. He assumed that they would take care of it. And so he found it interesting, but didn't take any action on it.
It should have percolated up through the FBI system to the top. And I have to say that your anecdote about Alexis Albion calling you with this slide that she had come across, to me, it's a great illustration of the cooperation that existed among the different teams on the 9/11 Commission staff.
Well, and I think that was one of the important reasons for having me in the cross-cutting role that I did, so that I could talk to different members of the different teams, keep them apprised of what was important and interesting, so that led someone like Alexis to immediately recognize what she saw as relevant to what I was doing.
You couldn't have tunnel vision. You had to expand the scope of what you were looking at. Alarms were going off, but we never quite got to the full fire, and I think that's a really great explanation. Barbara, I remember you talking about how we needed to have 3D glasses to see it all clearly, what was happening. Tell us what you meant by that.
Well, it goes back to what I was saying earlier, which is the FBI had a certain set of lenses through which they looked and perceived the world. And CIA had its own lenses that made it look at and perceive things in a certain way. It's only when you have sort of those 3D glasses that put them together that you get the full perspective and things really come to life. And I think that was the challenge, that each of the agencies had almost their own blinders on and looked through it through a particular lens that didn't allow them to sort of see across the entire government as to what might be interesting to them. So in terms of my cross-cutting role, it's the perfect example how having people who had their own lenses looking at things but recognizes what might be interesting to me and bringing that to me allowed me to pull that together and look at it in 3D as opposed to in this isolated view.
Say a little bit more about your experience working with both the FBI and the CIA during your investigation.
With each of these agencies, we had points of contact who were the designated people for whom we would go through to request interviews or request documents. We kind of derisively called them our minders because they would sit in on interviews. But building strong relationships with them was important because then they would go that extra mile to try to help you to get what you needed. There were differences between the CIA and the FBI leadership on how they viewed these requests and dealing with it. And there were particular people at higher levels of the CIA who were unhappy with the questions I was asking and, more importantly, with the conclusions I was drawing. The FBI was far more cooperative at all levels, and I think Director Mueller really saw the potential impact of the commission on the structure of the FBI. We could recommend that it be divided into two different organizations with a domestic intelligence agency sort of akin to an MI5 in the UK, and then the law enforcement agency. And so he knew that it was important to ensure that we had everything we needed.
Because he didn't want to see that division.
He did not want to see that division. We also talked earlier about the fact that, when you're at the Inspector General and you're investigating agencies, people generally don't want to speak to you. They don't want to be part of the investigation. Just stay away from me. I found it different on the 9/11 Commission. Because of the importance of the Commission's work and the story that they wanted to get out there. I found people in many of the agencies really wanted to be interviewed by the 9/11 Commission. They wanted to have a chance to say something.
They wanted their story told.
They wanted their story told. And so when I went out to these field offices with the FBI, I would come in with a list of people who I wanted to talk to. And there was a large number because I had a whole team coming, and we might do 40 interviews in a week that were visiting. And there would be people who were upset they weren't on that list. Why weren't they being interviewed by the 9/11 Commission? And I have never had that experience in an investigation before, where people were clamoring to get their story told.
Mostly they're hiding under their desks or
Yes,
something.
exactly. Keep me away. Don't talk to me.
We would like to thank our sponsor, Carnegie Corporation of New York. The Philanthropic Foundation supports innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. Learn more at carnegie.org. And the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center is the nation's key nonpartisan policy forum for tackling global issues through independent research and open dialogue to inform actionable ideas for the policy community. This brings us to something I think that we really need to address, because I think it's a lot of people in the public are confused by it. There was a so-called wall, and I'm making air quotes when I say the word wall with my fingers. The so-called wall that some claimed prevented intelligence agencies and law enforcement from communicating with one another. I think the American public was surprised to learn about obstacles in our agencies sharing critical threat information. What the heck? Our tax dollars are going, to the U.S. government to protect us, and they're not sharing information. What's that all about? But Barbara, you're the expert on this. Can you shed light on what this whole controversy was about? Break it down. What was the infamous wall? Was it important? Was it a real thing?
Well, the wall turned out, not to be a real thing. It was something that was an artificial artifact created by some people, particularly at the Department of Justice and the chief judge on the FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act court at the time, to keep control, keep FISA warrants within their control, and concern that if intelligence was shared with law enforcement agencies, some bad things could happen. For example, that law enforcement agents might release intelligence information, that it might become something that has to come out in a court case. So classified information would no longer be protected. So there was that concern.
And possibly compromise prosecutions?
It would be more likely that it would compromise the intelligence work that was being done if the public heard about intelligence activities. But it came down, this is pretty arcane, but let me try
This is inside Washington baseball.
It really is. But it had to do with, there is one standard for getting a criminal warrant, which was you had to show probable cause that a crime was committed and that information or evidence of that crime would be where you're going to do the search. The standard for a FISA court warrant was very different. It had to do that it was an agent of a foreign power. And you didn't have to have that same standard that you did in a criminal case. And there was a concern by the chief judge of the FISA court that agents would go to a FISA warrant instead of a criminal warrant because they thought it might be easier to get and therefore bypass the rigors of the Fourth Amendment protections for U.S. citizens. That's all pretty arcane. But what happened was, and this is kind of a sad story of what happened in this circumstance. There had been discussions, there had been prior investigations that discovered that information was not being shared between the intelligence community and law enforcement and vice versa. And there was a decision through a number of people that got up to Attorney General Janet Reno
in the Clinton administration,
that this information wasn't being shared and there need to be some guidelines about this. And so a set of guidelines after many meetings were negotiated, that essentially said, you have to share the information. But there was a particular individual in the Justice Department who ran the Office of Intelligence and Policy Review who had fought vehemently against that particular guideline, lost that fight, but decided to act as if they had won that fight. They basically told the FBI agents who would bring FISA warrants to this office. This office was the one responsible for reviewing any FISA warrants and presenting it to the FISA court. So it was the gatekeeper to the FISA court. That if they didn't, if they shared information, they wouldn't get their FISA warrants approved. It turned out that individuals in the department decided to act as if this memo said something the opposite of what it really said. And therefore, everyone became afraid of sharing intelligence and law enforcement information because they were afraid that they might get in trouble in front of the FISA court.
So what does all this have to do with the 9/11 Commission investigation?
First was, we talked earlier about the failures to share information at various points in time, and many of those failures could be tied, particularly during the Summer of Threat, to this concern about this wall, the perceived wall, and therefore that they couldn't share information about each other. So there would be people in the same room discussing certain aspects of al-Qaeda efforts and what they knew. And these people had information that would have been very helpful to representatives from the other agencies about al-Qaeda's actions, and the information wasn't shared. This became very important for the 9/11 Commission because there came a point in time when then Attorney General John Ashcroft was going to testify in front of the commission.
A public hearing.
A public hearing. And prior to...
When was that?
It would have been the early summer of 2004. Attorney General Ashcroft had received information that had been leaked about some of the findings that we were going to talk about in the staff statement during the particular hearing in which he was going to testify, where some witnesses had indicated that he had told the FBI to stop briefing him about counterterrorism.
So that was in the months before the 9/11 attacks,
right.
And so it was critical of him and his leadership.
Yes, and suggested that he just wasn't interested in counterterrorism. So he learned of this in advance and decided that he was going to take some action that would be critical of the 9/11 Commission and perhaps make it look that it was biased or trying to hide some things of its own.
The best defense is a good offense.
Correct. So he came to our public hearing. Unlike all the other witnesses, he did not provide his prepared statement in advance. And he had decided unilaterally over the weekend to declassify a particular memo that had been drafted by Jamie Grewe.
Again, who was one of the commissioners.
To sum it all up, it basically accused Jamie Grewe of actually creating this wall between law enforcement and intelligence and thereby, in fact, causing the 9/11 attacks.
And what were the repercussions of that accusation?
Well, the immediate repercussions were a number of personal threats against Commissioner Grewe, but it also threatened the commission itself because it suggested that one of the commissioners, in fact, caused the attacks that were being investigated by the commission. There were a number of members of Congress who wrote letters and signed them demanding that Jamie Grewe be removed from being a commissioner.
And did you investigate this specific accusation?
I did, at length, in detail. I won't bore the listening public today with all the minutiae about that. If they're very interested in this, there's in fact a staff statement I wrote that goes into all the details about this. But part of that investigation involved me, in fact, having to interview Jamie Grewe under oath. And there's nothing like having your boss sit down and making them raise their right hand and saying, I'm investigating you. I interviewed Jamie Grewe under oath for more than 3 hours and investigated a number of other key witnesses to get to the bottom of exactly what happened, which was then written in the monograph. The interesting thing is this ploy by Attorney General Ashcroft, in fact, backfired.
How so?
Because the commission, not only was Jamie Grewe not removed as a commissioner, but the other commissioners, including, she was one of the Democrat commissioners, and we had 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats. The other commissioners, who were all men, as she describes them, became her brothers that day. And they rallied around her because they viewed this as an attack on the integrity of the commission itself.
And they also knew it was a false accusation.
Correct. I mean, they knew that it was generally false. They didn't know all the details, which is why they made sure that we investigated it thoroughly.
And Barbara, if I know anything about you, is that you do things thoroughly.
They knew I was going to get to the bottom of it. And I would call the balls and strikes fairly, and that I would do it objectively. They rallied together, and in fact, it brought the commissioners together in a way that they hadn't quite yet experienced. And I think that totally backfired from what Attorney General Ashcroft wanted to accomplish. But I think the important story of the wall that people should be left with is that although it wasn't real, it was an artifact created by people who wanted to maintain their power, and that they were able to get agencies to abide by this, and it had actual impact on the sharing of information prior to the attacks. Even though, in the end, the FISA court actually had a case that came up to it and decided that there was no legal basis requiring the wall.
Thanks for all those details. Barbara, what most surprised you in your investigation? Were there any particularly notable challenges or roadblocks that you had to overcome?
I mean, there were a number of challenges. First of all, we had an impossible deadline originally in the law that created the commission, and there was no way we were going to get done in time. And we had to, in fact, have Congress increase our time by a small amount, not a large amount. So the time pressure was great. I remember that if I got home by 11 o'clock at night on the weekends even, that was a good night. Obviously, there were challenges along the way about getting the information you needed, and sometimes challenges even working among a high-performing, talented staff. Obviously, there's conflicts at times between people who want to do it this way or do it that way, or demands on resources. And so there are times when it was frustrating. But I think the important thing was to keep the eye on the prize and say, this is what we are trying to accomplish, and make sure that we do that. And I believe we did it.
So many conspiracy theories have sprung up about the attacks on September 11, 2001. Your work debunked some of these. Are there any in particular you'd like to mention?
Yeah, there's so many of them, but there's one that particularly sticks in my craw. I remember being at an event when someone from a legitimate news organization, I would consider a legitimate journalist, came up to me and tried to claim that a plane had not gone into the Pentagon. It was a government missile that went into the Pentagon. And I thought, how on earth can this responsible journalist who supposedly is looking for facts themselves believe this? And when I asked the questions, their response was, well, if it had been a plane, there would have been plane parts. I'm like, there were plane parts. In fact, there was jet fuel that people had in their lungs. We had a member of the staff who had jet fuel in his lungs. He had been in the Pentagon that morning and was grievously injured. And they said, well, there would have been video of it. I'm like, there was video of it. And then I said, and what do you think happened to all the people that were on that plane? And I specifically said, and I am personally offended because I had a friend on that plane, and you're telling me that, in fact, she was on some plane, that plane disappeared, has not been heard from again, but did not go into the Pentagon. I said, do you know what you're really saying? Yet I couldn't convince them that, in fact, these hijackers had taken a plane and flown it into the Pentagon. There was ample physical evidence, all kinds of things that would show that's the case. And here is this person who still believed that it was the U.S. government that actually put a missile into the Pentagon to try to create issues. I truly, to this day, do not understand that.
Conspiracy theorists don't want facts. They have their minds made up. It's just based on their personal beliefs. What would you say is your most vivid memory in your work on the commission that you'd like to share with our listeners?
Well, I think one of the personal vivid memories is being able to read a staff statement that I had drafted with the help of other members of the staff, laying out the summer of threat and the facts surrounding that. I was able at this point in time, the hearings were on public television and many people were watching them. The earliest hearings of the 9/11 Commission were not very closely watched, but by this time they were highly anticipated and had very large audiences. And so in being able to read my staff statement and get that information out to the American public was really, really important and very memorable. The second most memorable piece was, and I know you share this memory, of being in the room when the commissioners voted to adopt the report, the final report, unanimously. And in Washington, have a unanimous acceptance of a report, no dissents, no addenda, but I think something slightly different, having hundreds and hundreds of pages of detailed factual information and recommendations, and the commissioners, 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, unanimously voted to adopt the report. I felt like I was looking through the keyhole into history.
This is a special moment. How did Governor Tom Kean and Congressman Lee Hamilton's leadership, they were the chairs of the commission, shape the commission's work? And do you even think that today such bipartisan work is possible?
Tom and Lee's leadership should be a study for papers to come on how to do it. There were a number of aspects of their leadership, one of which was really important, was that they decided to be essentially co-chairs. When Governor Kean called Lee Hamilton for the first time after they had been selected, he said, "We're going to be co-chairs," or something to that effect. And they decided that when they went out to publicly talk about the commission's work, they would always do it together so that people could not put a wedge between them and say, oh, well, that's a Republican's viewpoint, that's a Democrat's viewpoint, and try to push them apart. The commission was, in fact, designed to fail. The White House did not want the commission for various reasons and the timing of it and all of that. And the idea in Washington, if you put 5 Republicans and 5 Democrats, the assumption was nothing would get done and it would be relegated to the dustbin of history. And by joining together like that and providing that leadership not only to the staff but to the other commissioners, they ensured that the commission's legacy endures to today. And I think that that's very important. And it became an example shortly after the commission's report was issued in 2004. We had made 41 recommendations, and Congress just began to look at the recommendations and to consider legislation. Interestingly enough, I forget who was the leadership in the Senate at the time, but they decided that it would be the Homeland Security and Government Operations Committee of the Senate, as opposed to the Intelligence Committee of the Senate, that would consider and held hearings about this potential legislation. And Senator Joe Lieberman and Senator Susan Collins were selected. I mean, they were the chair, the ranking member and the ranking minority member. And so the two of them led this effort. And they took a page from the Tom and Lee playbook and said, there's going to be no daylight between us. They spoke in public together. And by working together in that same fashion, the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act of 2004 was signed into law in December, just a few months after we issued our report.
Which is moving at light speed for legislation.
Hyper light speed for legislation. I mean, I don't think it's ever been done before. And by doing that, because there are so many people who said, this goes too far, it doesn't go far enough. Senator Lieberman and Senator Collins, by working together, were able to navigate the shoals that you would normally run into in this kind of legislation. And so I think that they saw how Tom and Lee behaved and acted, and by following that same model, they were able to get the largest reform in the intelligence community since the National Security Act of 1947 in record time.
Did the findings of your part of the investigation directly lead to specific recommendations? You talked about 41 recommendations that the commission made to keep the country safe.
I think the most important one was to create the DNI to coordinate
What's the DNI?
The Director of National Intelligence.
There hadn't been one of those?
No. So Director Tennant was head both of the CIA and of the intelligence community. And it was determined that each of those was too big a job to be combined with the other. And so there was created a separate sort of neutral umpire for the intelligence community, the Director of National Intelligence.
So the commission makes its recommendations. They were passed into law. If the country faced a threat similar to that in summer of 2001, the summer of threat, would things be any different today, do you think?
I'm convinced they'd be different.
That's reassuring.
Yes. Well, partly because of my work helping implement the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission that I've done through helping different parts of the U.S. government, my work at MITRE. I've actually had a chance to help form the organizations and work under some of the organizations like the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, that was created to improve information sharing. I've actually worked on coming up with strategies and plans to address particular threats. So I've seen these things in action. The structures and authorities and capabilities are all there. The one bit of caution I have is that all of these things are done by humans. As I like to say, information sharing would be very easy if people weren't involved. Because
Amen.
Yeah, because people make decisions and they have personal biases, or information is power, and so they might decide that it's against their personal interests. So it's not perfect. Are the essential instruments or capabilities there to make it better? The answer is clearly yes. The agencies clearly work together more collaboratively. They understand better who needs to know what and making sure that that information is shared. So there's been dramatic improvements. If we had a similar thing to the summer of threat, there would be much better cooperation within the government. There would be much better cooperation with state and local officials. And there might even be information given to the American public. Keep your eyes out. We have things of saying, keep your eyes out for this or that.
That is very reassuring. Barbara, some of our listeners were not even born when we were attacked on September 11, 2001. What would you say to these young people about the work of the Commission and its relevance to today?
I think the Commission has relevance in a number of different ways. One is by being an important example of how a fair investigation and looking at the facts and reforming government can take place in a meaningful way. And that's not always been a given. The example of the 9/11 Commission and how its staff conducted the investigation has become sort of a standard for all future commissions as they organize to think about how to be successful. I think that that's important. The other thing for people to understand, there's the saying, if people who fail to understand history are destined to repeat it. understanding what went wrong prior to the 9/11 attacks, which is carefully laid out in our report, can help people say, okay, this is how things can go wrong. What can I do to make sure that they go right? And so I think just understanding as well the immense threat that our country was under, and yet somehow we rallied and survived from that, I think is also an important lesson.
We've been speaking with Barbara Grewe. Barbara, thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike.
Barbara's work in relentlessly pursuing the truth allowed her to tell this story to the American people and led to recommendations that significantly improved the government's ability to keep our country safer. With her prosecutor experience, she knew how to look where others wouldn't have thought to and ask the right questions of the right people to shine a light on the events that led to the tragedy of 9/11.
In the next episode of the Are We Safer Today podcast, we'll be hearing from my co-host, Mike Hurley, the man who, in the run-up to a contentious election, was in charge of leading Team 3, the team responsible for investigating CIA covert action directed at al-Qaeda, the National Security Council and the Pentagon, as well as both the Clinton and George W. Bush administration.
But nonetheless, you're right. You're in this situation where you're sitting across from the President of the United States. And I think it's important when you go into those situations to realize it's not really you. You're not there because of, I wasn't there because I'm Mike Hurley, whatever weight that would carry. I was there because I was representing the American people. And when you think about it, it's pretty awe-inspiring.
Michael's team investigated some of the most sensitive counterterrorism programs, the crown jewels of American intelligence. Join us as we continue to explore through the eyes of the investigators the most extensive investigation in U.S. history.
Thank you for listening to the Are We Safer Today podcast. This was made possible thanks to our sponsors, Carnegie Corporation of New York and the Wilson Center.
I'm Barbara Grewe.
I'm Mike Hurley. This is the Are We Safer Today podcast. Thanks for listening.
If you enjoyed this podcast, be sure to check out the Are We Safer Today documentary film. In it, the 9/11 commissioners discuss their historic work, what they did and how they did it. Available in broadcast or streaming from your local public television station or pbs.org/video. Special thanks to the Center on Representative Government at Indiana University, along with Paul and Cindy Simon Scott and the Sumerian Foundation. Are We Safer Today is a production of Naptown Media. Executive producer Bob Massey. Produced by Shelby Hiltunen with associate producer Emily Twergle. Editors Matt Massey and PJ Wilson. Recorded at Interface Media Group in Washington, D.C. with sound engineer Dennis Jacobson. Thanks to Sarah Jackson and Grant McPollen. Theme music by House Music and Sound.